Okay, so Naruto has been out for a very long time now. It's been about like 20 years since the anime was made, and I don't really need to go into why the anime was as iconic as it was. But I feel like one thing that doesn't really get talked about enough that should is some of the powers in the show and how I think interesting they really were. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about one of those powers, namely the rasengan, and why I believe that it is definitely one of the most iconic and interesting powers in all of anime. Okay, so when I say this, right, I'm assuming you probably think that I'm talking about like what this power meant for Naruto, what kind of impact this power had on the series, or like what kind of legacy the Rasengan had on like the anime industry or something like that. But that is not at all what I want to talk about. And instead, I want to talk about why I believe that the Rasengan, from a power system perspective, I think is one of the best examples of a power that is extremely interesting, that has a lot of good exposition for it, and that honestly can tell us so much about the power system of the anime itself. Honestly, this video is a bit hard for me to pin down in what I'm trying to explain, but hopefully as you watch it, maybe you can understand the point I'm trying to make. Okay, so to begin, I first need to go over this concept of a black box. So a black box is pretty much a computer science term, which pretty much means that you have some input that you know about, then you have some process in between, and then afterwards the input gets transformed using the process to the output. But the important part here is that you don't actually know how the input gets turned into the output. So for example, right, Siri is a black box, since if you use Siri, you don't actually know how it works. You just tell it something and then it gives you the result. Or ChatGPT is a black box, so we don't know how that works. Only the people who made those tools actually know how they work, right? And the reason this is important is because every anime that deals with power systems are pretty much black boxes, every single one. So Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, Dragon Ball, anything you can think of is a black box, because they don't actually explain what the transition between the power that they have, which is I guess the life force energy, so Nen, chakra, or devil fruits and things like that. How do those get turned into the power, and then how does the power actually affect things in real life? So for example, right, if you want to talk about devil fruits, we obviously have the categorization of them. So there's logias and the paramecias and then there's zones and stuff like that. But for example, if you take a logia type, they don't actually explain how the body turns into fire, like what is the mechanism happening here. Or for example, right, in this scene here, when there's this guy that's just made of sand, what is even happening here? Like, is his body completely made of sand? Does he have blood coursing through his body at all? Is his brain made of sand? Because if his brain is made of sand, then how is his brain even talking to the rest of his body to actually do anything? I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. They don't actually explain this, and that's why this process is a black box, since we don't actually know how it works, and they don't ever explain this. Honestly, this is kind of a topic I kind of want to make a separate video on, because I think it's a very interesting idea. I really enjoy it when some TV show or any fiction, right, really goes into detail about these kind of mechanisms. Okay, so moving on, how does this relate to Naruto? Well, firstly, chakra is also a black box, so it's not that chakra is somehow the exception to this rule. But the difference is that the Rasengan is one of the few powers in anime which actually goes out of his way to actually interact with its energy source, that being chakra, right? And by doing that, it actually reduces how much of a black box it actually is. And that is what pretty much makes it such an interesting power, in my opinion. Okay, so there's three ways I want to talk about this. Firstly, how the Rasengan actually does this. Secondly, and what kind of effects it doing this actually has. And then finally, the impact that this actually has on this story, and also how we actually interpret what's happening with the Rasengan as well. Okay, so firstly, right, when you go on to actually learn the Rasengan, there are three steps involved that you have to learn to actually create it. So first, you have to be able to rotate chakra in multiple directions at once, and then afterwards, you have to be able to add more power to this Rasengan by adding more chakra to it and basically compress it and make it more dense. And then after you master that, you have to be able to contain this Rasengan as well, so that it doesn't just basically go in every direction at once and just completely break apart. And I think it is because of this exposition that we have for it that we can actually intuitively figure out how difficult this doing this actually is. For example, right, if you equate chakra and water as being the same thing, we can say that all we're really doing is we're trying to rotate water in multiple directions at once. Then we're trying to add more power to the water by adding more water to it and basically compressing it. And then we're trying to contain it so that this water bowl that we have, it doesn't just break apart. Now, obviously, I don't really know how you would contain it, right? Because you don't really have superpowers in real life. But you can imagine, however way you would do it, it would probably be really difficult. And because we can intuitively figure out that doing this is really hard, we can then also say that creating the rasengan by using the same principles would also be really difficult to do as well. Okay, so aside from this, right, the reason I think this is so interesting is because now that we know how this process works and how the rasengan, how the chakra turns into the rasengan, what we can do is that we can figure out our own ways to modify the rasengan. And to do that, all we really need to do is just play around with these parameters. And that is exactly what the show did, because all they did was they just created so many different variations of the rasengan. So, for example, they made a rasengan that was like 10 times the size and it was much bigger. And by looking at it, you could intuitively tell that it had more chakra added to it. Or they created a rasengan that had chakra natures added to it, which is pretty much what the Rasen Shuriken was. Or this one here, which had the lava release added to it as well. And not only that, we could actually create our own variations of the rasengan just by playing around with these parameters. So, for example, chakra is an energy source that is invisible by nature. You can't actually see it in Naruto. The only way you can see it is if it's in a highly concentrated form, and that is pretty much why you can see the rasengan, because it is just a highly concentrated ball of chakra. But what we can say is that if adding a lot of chakra to the rasengan makes it translucent, we can try to come to a conclusion that adding even more chakra to the rasengan would make it opaque, or maybe it might make it really shiny or something like that. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you can really start to see why this is so interesting. Okay, so finally, right, now that we know how we can create the rasengan, and we can figure out that since doing this with water is really difficult, then doing this with chakra would also be somewhat difficult as well. And on top of that, you also add this idea that variations of the rasengans are just you playing around with these properties. What we can say is that the rasengan has pretty much become a really good way for us to figure out how strong Naruto has become throughout the series. So at the beginning of the series, he would always need a shadow clone to help create the rasengan, and whenever he did create it, it would always take him a lot of time. But at the very end, when he became an adult, he could do it with one hand, and he basically created this massive rasengan shown here, right? And from this, we can easily figure out a couple of things. Firstly, he put in a lot of chakra to create it, and putting in that much amount of chakra requires a lot of fine chakra control, so he has become more skilled. And then finally, he only needed one hand to actually create the Rasengan as well, and it didn't even take that long to do it. So we can figure out that he has become much stronger at the end of the series than he was at the beginning. And we can easily figure this out just by looking at the Rasengan. Now, this is kind of trivial, right? And you don't really need me to tell you that as the series progressed, Naruto became stronger and stronger. But the reason I think this is so interesting is because normally in anime, you have powers that you don't really understand because they're black boxes, and they use that power to go from being able to destroy like rocks or something to then being able to destroy the planet. And because we don't know what the principle behind the power is, we can't actually tell whether when they did that, whether that was impressive or not. In Naruto, right, with Naruto's Rasengan, we could tell because Naruto just created a bigger Rasengan with more chakra, and from that we could extrapolate that he had finer chakra control and a lot more things, right? But with normally in anime, with most powers, you can't actually make that intuition because you don't actually know what the principle behind the power is. Plus, you also have this other factor as well, that when they go from being able to destroy like rocks to like destroy planets, it's not like humans have ever destroyed the planet, right? I mean, no humans ever destroyed the planet, right? So it's hard for us to really figure out how impressive that really is, because that is really impressive when a character in anime does that. But since that is so outside of our own set of experiences, it's hard for us to figure out how impressive that is. Being able to destroy a rock to then being able to destroy the entire planet. So hopefully that makes sense. Honestly, as much as I'm praising the ability, I'm not gonna lie, after a while as the show progressed, it did become a bit weird because there was just so many variations of the rasengan, and doing that did kind of trivialize what was actually happening with it. Like in this scene here, when they made the mini Rasen Shuriken, I don't know, it just lost a lot of, I guess, I don't know, I just stopped liking it as much, right? So, because after a while, it wasn't even an ability that was hard for Naruto to make, or an ability that actually took a lot of time for him to actually make, right? So, yeah, over time, it did actually lose a lot of its, I think, value. But generally speaking, I did really like the ability, and I think there hasn't really been that many abilities in anime that have been as interesting as the Rasengan, in how much it actually tried to bridge the gap between the energy source to what the ability actually is. So to actually get rid of the black box factor of it. But anyways, right, that's all I have to say. Let me know what you think as well, and let me know if you think there's another ability that is as interesting as the Rasengan is, in the sense of it actually tried to get rid of how much of a black box it actually was. If you think there are other abilities like that that I'm just, I guess, ignoring, or that I don't know about, then let me know. But okay, that's all I have to say. Let me know what you think, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.